Welcome, everyone. My name is Dina Aronoff. I'm the director of the GTU Center for Jewish Studies, the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union, a sister program and center to the UC Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies. And thank you, Etta Haber, for creating this program and bringing it together, and to Shauna and the Magnes staff for handling all of the logistics to bring to us what I know will be a very moving and transformative program. If you're here, then you're here because you know that Irene and Helene Silverblatt together have been involved in an amazing recovery. A recovery of a volume, a recovery of a voice, a recovery of a poetry, a recovery of a history, of a town, of a people. And it's really a time now, I think, of such dizzying change. And in scholarship especially, the constant framing and reframing of the Holocaust and those who endured it, that for me there's something very significant about taking the production of the writings of people who endured the Holocaust and bringing it to the world at this time of major transformation. Just to tell you a bit about our accomplished speakers, Irene Silverblatt is a professor of cultural anthropology at Duke University and studies the cultural expressions of power. And her own academic interests have really taken her into the distant past through contemporary Europe, and she has received many very esteemed fellowships for her scholarship. Helene Silverblatt, MD, is a professor of psychiatry and family and community medicine at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. Her focus is on healthcare workforce development and distribution as a way to transform primary care practice and healthcare delivery. I think you can see a very powerful complementary relationship between your interests and a resistance to any rigid compartmentalization of what it is to understand and better the human condition. So without any more words, I introduce our speakers to then introduce us to Selma Mirbaum-Eisinger.
Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction, and I think that kind of introduction gives our work even more power and meaning to all of you here. You should know that I rarely hold a microphone this way, but there's one other person in the audience who has seen me do this, and that is Marcy Weiss Beck, who we went to high school with many years ago, who is here with her husband, Jimbo Beck, who is part of the California scene, but many years ago, Marcy and Irene and I were part of the Philadelphia scene, and one of the things we loved was pretending that we were the Temptations. So I want to thank Etta Heber and Shauna Vesco and the entire crew here for making this opportunity available to us. And I also want to thank some other blasts from our past who are here. I want to thank Hope Bryson and her partner Paco for coming and visiting us today. Thank you very much. And for Melina Salvador, who has graduated from, and Tony, who has graduated from the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry to becoming all but her dissertation and working like hell on it now, candidate for her PhD in medical anthropology at Berkeley. So we are thrilled to have so many connections here today. But we'd like to talk today about a connection that we discovered as adults, and that was to Selma Mirbaum-Eisinger. And this talk today will be a talk not only about her life, but the world that surrounded her, as we read her poetry and listen to the elaboration of her poetry after her death. Selma Mirbaum-Eisinger died in a Nazi labor camp on December 17th, 1942. She was 18 years old. Selma reached out to the world with poetry, and her words grabbed life, even as the world around her was slipping into an arena of death. In the course of a life cut short, Selma wrote over 50 poems in German and translated another 5 from Yiddish, French, and Romanian. She wrote with startling honesty about love and heartbreak, about desire and loss, about injustice and modeled hope. Selma found beauty in the fragility of chestnuts, comfort in the loneliness of rain, grief in rural poverty, and with despairing courage, faced a future that wanted her. So this is hard stuff to read, and I know you all know that, but it's hard to read. I appreciate everyone's good feelings and solidarity in sharing all the emotions that come with this presentation too. And she faced a future that wanted her and an entire way of being to fade like smoke and leave no trace, which is what she wrote in her poem, Tragedy. We know so little about Selma. Literary scholars speak of her in larger tracts about German literature in the Bukowina. Some friends wrote about her in memoirs. Others talked about her to Jürgen Serke, a German journalist who discovered Selma's original handwritten album of poetry in Israel and included these stories in the first commercial publication of Selma's collected work. Now, sadly, it is too late to ask much more. Of course, we also have Selma's poetry that holds personal desire and the terrors of mid-20th century in one intimate embrace. Opening her experiences to our eyes and hearts, Selma's poems have an immediacy, a directness, an urgency that bridge the 70 years since their creation. Can you put up the next slide? So this is Selma and her friend, Elsa. Sharing her imaginings of the world around her, we walk arm in arm through the streets of Czernowitz, feel the rain as if it were on our faces, hope the wind will give us courage too, and together explode with outrage or descend into numbing disbelief. With piercing words and plaintive voice, Selma Mirbaum-Eisinger is our guide to sensuous, joyous, and devastating first love, to the soaring beauty of her birthplace, and to the shadows of nationalist hatreds that stalked her and her poetry until they strangled both. Next. So this is a map of the region in Middle Europe where Selma was from, and I don't have like a pointer, but I have this. Okay, so here's Czernowitz. Right. So you can see how close it is to all these borders. Do you see it, everybody? Yeah? Okay. So it's called Czernowitz now because Czernowitz and Czernowitz are the same community because it was a place of moving boundaries and moving nationalities. So when Selma was born there, it was called Czernowitz. And that's what we will probably say through most of the talk, but it is now called Czernowitz in Ukrainian. It's part of the Ukraine. So Selma came from Czernowitz, which was famously described by her cousin, the renowned poet of the Holocaust, Paul Celan, as the city where human beings and books used to live. Located at the far eastern edge of what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Czernowitz was the capital of its Bukowina province, a lush region marked by the Carpathian Mountains and a swirl of ethnicities, a legacy of the empire's multilingual cultural policies. This is a view of Czernowitz from the roof, right? And you can see It's the buildings, the construction of its buildings, as well as the mountains in the background. And we'll be returning to the legacies and the stories behind, but what we'd like to do now is talk more about her poems. Many of Selma's poems, particularly the earlier pieces, insist on the beauty and insight of Chernovitz's natural world. Like the romantic poets that she loved, Selma finds a soulmate in the trees, the sky, the sunshine of her dear Bukovina. Selma revels in the glory of spring, a springtime that laughs at the world's little foibles, like when a fly doesn't want to share his sun-drenched bench with a tiny yellow butterfly. Afternoon.
Slender branches like unworldly veils rise up out of slender birch tree trunks, and the silence, as in a ceremony, seems intent on damming up the sky, lest it lose itself, enraptured by the bird songs. Brown sodden paths, and a blossoming tree discovering the world anew, it seems. Soft green grasses barely sprout. All the firs have turned green again, and a tiny yellow butterfly makes bold to come to rest here on a sun-drenched bench. This does not suit a green fly at all. The sun, it thinks, is meant for it alone. Only tips of blackthorn whisper softly, no.
And as fall descends upon Chernovitz, chestnuts offer a compassionate philosophy about summer's end, something which trees and humans much endure. Chestnuts.
Scattered on the smooth, bright path, wearily they lie at rest, brown and smiling like two tender lips, full and shiny, lovely round. I hear them like a sparkling melody. I pick one up, caress it in my hand as though it were a tender, tiny child, and think about the tree, about the wind, which sang so softly through the leaves that to the chestnuts, this soft song must be like the summer, slipping past, leaving just this sound, its last farewell. And the one I have here in my hand is not brown and shiny like the rest. It is flat and sleepy like the sand that is trickling with it through my fingers, slowly, step by step, as if unwilling, I let my feet go wandering on ahead.
Selma also turned to the natural world to express the fragility of life, and perhaps a quixotic hope in life's capriciousness. Listen to one of her later poems, Storm.
Out there in your garden stands a rose bush, still without a trace of green, and you can hardly wait for it. Wait for the first bud, frail and thin, the one that heralds life reborn. You wait full of fear and trembling until the morning comes, and now it's here. And the bud is elegant and slender, still not open, difficult to see. And you want it to burst open instantly because you know how quickly frail things perish. But a day goes by, and then another passes, and the sky turns deeper blue, grows more expansive, and the bud does not burst open. And you know another frost will mean its death. Death before it's had a chance to live. You desire to help, but don't know how, and afraid of a heavy wind may rise, break it off, stealing it from you. At night, while you're asleep and cannot see, and at dawn it'll be dead. Then night comes and storms roar around your house, its doors all tightly closed. You rise with the start, you simply must go out, and your ears are filled with whimpering. Finally, you're outside and you could see the rose bush. Look, the bud has now burst open. What for weeks the sun could not accomplish, a single storm has done. And this is a true bud from Chernivtsi. Just want you to know. Authentic.
Right. Selma's parents were Austrian, but by 1924, when Selma was born, Černovic was under Romanian rule, ceded after Austria's defeat in World War I. Even so, an Austrian ethos permeated the city. Selma spoke German at home, and her romance with poetry began with the German masters. Yet her poetic sensibilities were also kindled by Černovic's riches in language and culture. That swirl of ethnicities, Ukrainian, Romanian, Armenian, German, Polish, Jewish, Hungarian, that had marked Černovic before the war. So this is a postcard that was taken of the main plaza in Černovic at the turn of the century, or certainly before World War I. And you can see the swirl of ethnicities here. Rosa Auslander, who's another well-known poet from Černivtsi, said that Černovic was the place where even the fish spoke 5 languages. And that so many languages were spoken and so many people knew each other's languages that even non-Jewish workers could speak Yiddish to the Jewish community. After the war, German remained the language of preference in a significant number of Černovic's homes and maintained its aura as a sacred idiom of sorts, the language of civilization's most eloquent ideals in poetry, theater, and thought. This was Černovitzer German, still tempered by the many other languages, Ukrainian, Yiddish, Romanian, Polish, heard in the capital's thoroughfares, its gardens, its cafes, and its classrooms. This is Selma Eisinger's rich linguistic home. And this is a copy of a picture of the Jewish house. The Jewish house is significant because it was one of many or several houses in Černovic that represented the multicultural homes for its population that were built by the government as a meeting place, a political gathering spot, as a cultural home for Ukrainians, Romanians, Jewish people, Germans, and Polish people there. Selma's Černovic, however, was seething with conflict. A city where cosmopolitan hopes and ideals of universal justice tangled with the vicious passions of ethnic nationalism. Like Selma's family, many Černovitzers tried to adhere to multilingual traditions after the Bukovina region was absorbed into Greater Romania following Austria's defeat in World War I. But the multicultural milieu would not endure. Homegrown Romanian nationalists, bent on destroying the city's long-standing multi-ethnic traditions, imposed strict limitations on public language and on political thought as well. Černovic's Jews became all too familiar with Romanian anti-Semitism. Jews now found themselves the butt of official scorn and hatred. Quotas were drawn, Jews were harassed in the streets and markets, even murdered with impunity. As we will see, Romanian nationalists eventually forged an alliance with Hitler and transformed the Bukovina into a province of terror. Austrian architecture, perhaps, as we see here, conveys the dreams, and history reveals the illusions. These conflicts are with us still. In the Mirbaum household, personal hardship meshed with political oppressions. While the decades after World War I were difficult for most, Selma's family suffered an additional tragedy. When Selma was a toddler, her father, Max Mirbaum, died of tuberculosis. Selma's mother, Frieda Schrager, eventually remarried and raised Selma with her new husband, Leo Eisinger. The money they earned from a small odds and ends shop was just enough to rent a 2-room apartment. The Mirbaum Eisingers were poor. Selma's friends were startled by her poverty. Renee Abramovici described the apartment, and this is a quote from Renee's narrative. One entered through a corridor, and a couple of steps led directly into the kitchen. In the second room stood a master bed. At the foot of the sofa where Selma slept were 2 chests and a small writing table. No running water, no bath. But Selma's childhood friends also talked about her liveliness and her irreverence, as well as her sensitivity and her modesty. They talk about her enormous gifts and her shyness at revealing them. One friend reminisced how Selma could never keep still, how Selma would whistle at the window for her to come down to go out to a dance, even if it was late, and even if it was against her parents' wishes. Selma was contentious and independent, in constant battle with her mother over
It's a tradition in the family.
It's a family tradition. Over another issue, her curly, unmanageable hair. She was, yes, we've had those conversations, like both generations. That's what's so amazing, right? That one and this one. She was described as being careless about her looks, and when she was walking with her unrequited love, Lizer, Selma seemed to be rather lost in thought and impervious of appearance, in contrast to the introverted, neat, and all-in-control Lizer Fichman. And this was a quote from a very revealing book that's by Pearl Fichman, who was married to Lizer's uncle. And the name of this book is called Before Memories Fade. And there he is. There he is. We know little about Lizer Fichman, the young man who often accompanied Selma on her frequent walks in the park. Like Selma, he was active in the labor Zionist movement. Selma loved Lizer. She even dedicated her album of poetry to him. Selma describes Lizer with irony and affection in a poem called Pencil Sketch. Quote, "A dainty, shadowy strand of hair falls on the forehead. Above it, silken soft, the dark abundance. The mouth, defiant testimonial of proud aloofness, strengthened by a delicate black fuzz. And then she pleads with him in Necklace of Tears."
The days weigh damp and heavy, full of wild, anxious grief. I'm so cold and empty that I am about to die of fear. The birds are heading out for noon, and they're long gone. I can no longer see the aster bloom. The final butterflies depart. The mountains are dressed up for autumn. I am wrapped in yearning. For you, I yearn. My passionate song of yearning fills the world and me together with it. The droning rain accompanies my song. Whoever listens to the song sung by the rain, whoever is intoxicated with the grief, will also hear the music of my song. You, only you alone don't hear it. Do I know why? And when my song one day will shatter loudly, you'll remain so cold and mute. To you, it doesn't mean a thing that every tree pleads with compassion. Listen, you walk on by and barely notice me, as if you didn't know my dream. That's just the way you are. and yet you are so pale and gloomy, like the one who understands, who's struggling to suffocate his sighs and walks with an enormous burden. And yet there is an aching in your gaze and pain around your lips. Yes, you have squandered happiness. It never will return. And you're free. Well, happiness was just too heavy for you. Beside yourself, you wasted it. And now your hands are empty, filled with only loneliness. So there you stand, toss back your head with stubborn spite, and utter words you do not mean. Good riddance, happiness. And then, when it has disappeared, you stand there and your eyes gaze after it and passionately yearn for it. No more indifferent to it, then you're suddenly awake. Return it never shall. For you don't want to call it, even if the emptiness were so infinitely heavy that your back should break under its load. We too bear the selfsame sorrow, each of us alone. I am crowned by a heavy jewel of tears, and you by a precious stone of yearning. And the wind is singing its eternal song of yearning and renunciation to both of us. But even if you are deathly afraid, you still don't call.
Selma and her friends were passionate about ideas, passionate about art, and passionate about justice. Groups of students sharing a zeal for aesthetics and for politics gobbled up philosophy and theater, political theory and literature. One of the reasons why Selma would pick up her friend Renee at 10 o'clock at night was to go to their very favorite spot in the public gardens for frequent exchanges about the Spanish Civil War, the unfolding drama of European politics, Verlaine or Rilke's verses, or the poetry and novels of Rabindranath Tagore. Pearl Fickman, Selma's friend, describes her induction into this world of sensual intellect. The ferment of literary and social activity was almost physically felt in our town. It was a palpable force and lodestone for Czernovitz youth. Czernovitz, the city where human beings and book used to live, as Paul Celan said. The turbulence spawned by the rise of fascism, vicious ethno-nationalisms, the revolutionary dreams of the Soviet Union, the hardships of the Depression, industrial capitalism's stark divides, interlaced with a deeply felt aesthetic take on the world, shaped a core of committed young people who would cite poetry in one breath and Bakunin in another. It became dangerous to express political ideas that challenged their country's right-wing nationalism and the status quo. Selma and her friends were cautious, but they continued arguing, loving, and writing. Elsa Schechter-Karen writes how Selma wanted to live out every moment, and Elsa continued, as the war approached closer to us, we felt that we would be robbed of our youth. We were no longer able to seek out our gardens and meadows. We had to find hiding places. And on such long and lonely evenings, Selma wrote her lovely poems. Selma wrote poems of a woman in love, but she also, through poetry, confronted injustice and violence. As she describes the inequities of Czernovitz, her images of nature darken in sympathy with the desolation of everyday life.
Grief. Murky, muddy puddles mirror light, yellow, greasy, dirty too, and dense. Windows brightly lit lack any purpose. Doorways echo emptiness. The tired fog lies heavy on the streets, and the rain just pours and pours. People are too sad to even hate. And somewhere out there, a child is coughing. In the gardens lie half-rotten leaves. Benches stand there, and wet and gray. When it's seen it all, the sun comes later, and the moon is stingy with its glow. Daylight weakly penetrates the fog, dull and grayish, sticky, sludgy. Sleepily the guard plays with his saber, and a bird all wet is shivering so. Haggard, hungry horses standing there, oozing steam with empty eyes, soaked through, scattered on the moistened ground, oats now serve no useful purpose. Drenched from head to toe, a cat creeps along the moldy wall. With his collar raised, a farmer looks at his money. Will it see him through?
We'd like now to play a snippet of a song that was written to this poem by David Klein, a Swiss musician, a popular musician, that he put together an album of Selma's poems that were sung by some of Germany's most well-known singers. And this is sung by Herbert Grönemeyer, and it was on the top 10 charts for quite a while in Germany.
Lichter spiegeln sich in schmutzig nassen Pfützen. Gelb und fettig, schmutzig auch und schwer. Helle Häuserfenster können gar nichts nützen. Tore hallen, heer und leer. Liegt der Nebel müde auf den Straßen und der Regen rinnt und rinnt. Menschen sind zu traurig, um sich noch zu hassen, und es hüstelt irgendwo ein Kind.
Selma wrote of longing, and yes, she yearned for Lizer, but she also yearned to live an ordinary life, a decent life, a life of dignity, and a life of beauty. She yearned for a world that made human sense. The mayhem of living in a purposeless world, a world of Romanian nationalism that banned Yiddish and Romanian and Ukrainian from public ears. The perplexities of living in a world so at odds with humanity. This tore at Selma. The poem, Do You Know?
Do you know how a raven shrieks, and how Lady Night, afraid and pale, does not know where to flee? How the frightened night can't tell, is it or is it not her realm? Does she belong to the wind or he to her? And are not the rapacious wolves poised to devour their prey? Do you know how the wind howls shrilly, and how the woods, afraid and pale, do not know where to flee? How the frightened woods can't tell, is it or is it not their realm? Do they belong to the rain or the night? And isn't death, who's laughing grimly, their almighty Lord and Master? Do you know how the rain is weeping, and how I walk, afraid and pale, and don't know where to flee? How this frightened girl can't tell, is it or is it not her realm? Does the night belong to me or I to her? And isn't my mouth so pale and confused the one that's really crying?
This is a version of Do You Know, sung by a Dutch, written and sung by a Dutch performer, Herman van Veen.
Du weißt, du wie ein Rabe schreit und wie die Nacht erschrocken bleibt, nicht weiß, wohin zu fliehen. Wie sie verängstigt nicht mehr weiß, ist es ihr Reich, ist es nicht ihr Reich, gehört sie dem Wind oder er ihr und sind die Wölfe mit ihrer Gier nicht zum Zerreißen bereit. Du weißt, du wie der Schrill, der Wind schrill heult und wie der Wald erschrocken bleich nicht weiß, wohin zu fliehen. Wie er verängstigt nicht mehr weiß, ist es sein Reich, ist es nicht sein Reich, gehört er dem Regen oder der Nacht und ist der Tod, der schaurig lacht, nicht sein allerhöchster Herr.
Ion Antonescu, a fervent ethno-nationalist, took over the reins of government in 1940 and declared allegiance to Hitler. The Soviets occupied Chernovitz in 1940, but after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and with the Red Army in shambles, Romanian and German troops entered Chernovitz in the summer of 1941. Chernovitzers were well aware of Hitler's venom, but nothing could prepare them for what was to follow. Chernovitzers watched in shock as bloodied victims who survived pogroms in neighboring villages tried to escape to the city. Chernovitzers witnessed destruction and mass murder within the city's walls, and as German and Romanian troops set out to destroy Jewish life. Julius Scherzer wrote about these terrible times in a memoir called While the Gods Were Silent. And Selma, who was a close friend of his sister's, figured in this account. And he describes in a very, very powerful way how they became face to face with the patrol of Romanian soldiers and how they were recognized as Jews and where the message was conveyed to them, I want you dead. The Romanian government in Chernovitz, imposing the new German-allied fascist order, instigated measures of terror. Communists were rounded up, imprisoned, and shot, and Jews were stripped of citizenship, and all had to wear the public symbol of their identity as state pariahs, the infamous, always visible, yellow star. Jews were rounded up into a ghetto in October 1941, just about exactly 76 years ago. They were forced to leave their homes, their neighborhoods, and move to a confined, marginalized section of the city. But Selma, in the ghetto, wrote a poem that remarkably was about hope, a hope rooted in the love of life and in the abiding powers of language. It is named after the Austrian author and essayist Stefan Zweig. And I think, in the interest of time, we'll probably have to condense that. Maybe just read this paragraph. Okay.
I'll just read
the first stanza.
Luminous, radiant, thundering life bounds up and sweeps away, lets no one loose, makes hot and makes bold and makes joyful and large, shakes up and awakens with a powerful jolt, lets the floods of splendor ebb away no more.
And we're going to skip this next song, I think. After the ghetto was established, Romanians began to round up other Romanians, stripped of their citizenship because they were Jews, and transport them to what was called the Transnistria, a region across the Dniester River in Romanian-occupied Ukraine. In 1942, in July, the government deported over 2,000 to insect-infested, germ-ridden cesspools that were called labor camps. And among them were Selma, her parents, and the parents of Paul Celan. First, they were sent to a stone quarry. Then they were ordered to a labor camp in Mikhailovka, a village further east, and all 5 died. We know very little about her experience in the camp or about her last days. But first we have a letter that is most likely the last letter that she ever wrote. And this is to her dear friend Renee Abramovici, who had been deported also in 1941, but had been interned in a different camp. Remarkably, this letter reached Renee, and remarkably, she was managed to preserve it in spite of an arduous and years-long overland and overseas journey. It is an anguished cry, painfully direct, and with little comfort. And I'll just read an excerpt from it. The sky sobs wildly, and streams of tears crash on the earth, and oh, my house is empty. And this is a quote from Home and the World, a book by Tagore, which she took with her in the camp. And she added to that, I feel as if all my days, all my coming days, are freezing together into one solid mass, and will live forever on my breast. Of course, one bears it anyway. One endures, although one thinks again and again, now, it is too much. Now I have a chance to send you this incomplete outpouring. Kisses, Chazak, courage, Selma. We know about her last days because a Romanian artist named Arnold Dagani, who drew portraits of life in the camps, drew a portrait of her and said in his diary, her voice became ever smaller and weaker, then it was still. He called this drawing Pietà. That's the drawing, yeah.
They're lowering Selma.
And they're lowering Selma from her bunk in the camp. And this is available actually in England at this time. So Dagani writes that he and Selma sparred over his drawings of camp life. She was not intimidated by his renown and 15-year seniority.
She was tough.
She was tough. What was Selma's main concern was that Dagani had not adequately portrayed the camp's relentless cruelty. Okay, next one. Between 1939 and through 1941, Selma Mirbaum wrote 57 poems, including 5 translations from French, Yiddish, and Romanian. Days before she was sent across the Dniester River to Mikhailovka, Selma collected these poems in an album which she called Blütenlese, or Harvest of Blossoms. And she dedicated this album with love to Lazar Fickman. But this album also has a story to tell. First, a summary of this journey. Before the Romanians banished the family from Czernowitz, Selma gave Blütenlese to her friend Elsa Schechter-Karen, hoping that Elsa could somehow get the album to Lazar, who had already been deported, but to a different camp. We don't know how Lazar got the album, but he did. He must have cherished Blütenlese because he kept it with him throughout his internment. In 1944, after the Romanian camps had been liberated, Leiser decided to escape to Palestine. In Chernovitz, for one last time, he gave Blutenlese back to Elsa Schechter-Karen. He was afraid that something would happen to him, and something would happen to the album then, during his trek. And he said to Elsa, "I don't want Selma's poems to be lost." Leiser's ship was torpedoed, and it sank with no survivors. After the Russians recaptured Romania in 1944 and deportees began to straggle home from the camps, Elsa gave the album to Renee, the dear friend Selma wrote to from the camp. Carrying Selma's album in a rucksack, Renee began her own refugee's journey across Europe. On foot, rising in horse carts, or scrambling on the roof of passenger trains, Renee held the album close throughout the 4-year-long trek from Chernovitz. When she was finally given permission to go to Israel, Renee packed her goods in a trunk, but carried Blutenlese in the backpack. And it is fortunate that she did. The trunk was lost, but Selma's poem survived. For nearly 30 years, Selma's album kept Renee company. Renee called Blutenlese her homeland. And after 30 years, she eventually discovered that Elsa was also living in Israel, as was Hirsch Siegel, Selma's former math teacher. They were determined to make Selma's poetry accessible to others, and they organized a private printing. Okay, next slide. However, if it hadn't been for Paul Celan, Selma Mirbaum's poetry might never have had a commercial publication in Europe. When asked to contribute to a German anthology rooted in the Holocaust, Paul Celan insisted that one of Selma's poems appear next to his famed Todesfuge, or Death Fugue. It was here that Hilde Domin, who was a celebrated German poet, read poem, a lyric, she said, that one reads in excitement while weeping, so pure, so beautiful, so bright, and yet so threatened. So now with a poem. So this is music that's inspired by the poem, and we'll read the poem as we listen to the music.
The trees are bathed in softly shimmering light, and every leaf shines, trembling in the wind. The sky, a silky blue and clear, is like a dewdrop scattered by the morning wind. The evergreens are sealed in gentle redness and deeply bow before His Majesty the wind. Behind the poplar trees, the moon observes a child that's greeted her already with a smile. The bushes in the wind are marvelous. They're silver now, and now a luminous green, and then like moonlight spread on light blonde hair, and then as if prepared to bloom anew. I want to live. How colorful life is. It's so full of beautiful, wondrous things, and many lips are waiting, laughing, glowing, declaring their delight. Now look, see how the street is climbing, so wide and bright, just waiting there for me. And somewhere far away, there sobs and screams the yearning that takes hold of you and me. The wind roars, calling through the woods. It tells me that our life can sing. The air is quiet, tender, cold. The distant poplar waves and waves. I want to live. I want to laugh, to bear all my burdens, and want to do battle. No love and no hate. I want to hold heaven in my embrace and want to be free and breathe and scream. I don't want to die. No. for life is red, for life is mine, mine and yours, mine. Why do the cannons roar? Why must we give up life for sparkling gold? There's the moon. It's here, near, so near. I must wait. For what? They die. The numbers pile up. Never rise again. Never and never. I want to live. Brother, you too. Beneath breath departs from my mouth as it does from yours. Life is colorful. You want to kill me? Why? With 1,000 flutes, woods weep. The moon is bright silver in the blue. The poplars are gray. The wind roars at me. The street is bright. Then they come and strangle me. Me and you, dead. Life is red. Roars and laughs. Overnight, I am dead. A shadow of a tree floats ghost-like across the moon, barely visible. A tree. A tree. A life can cast shadows across the moon. A life. They die. The numbers pile up. Never rise again. Never. And never.
Hilda Domine showed this poem to Jürgen Serke, a journalist who has made his life's mission to track down poetry written by artists in exile. Thrilled by this discovery, Serke went to Israel to see if he could uncover more of Selma's works. And he told us this when we met him in Hamburg. He went from one house to another and loved the food, but eventually he was able to find Blutenlese and Hirsch Siegel's private publication. He then worked with a German publishing house to make it accessible to a broader audience. And this edition appeared in 1980, and it's what made Selma's work more accessible. And it resulted in her first touch of renown. And today this album, Blutenlese, is in Yad Vashem in Israel. Although her poetry initially reached a larger audience with the publication of the German edition, it took nearly 20 years for her poems to capture the attention of the wider public. Hoffmann und Campe, a German press, published her poetry, reissued it in 2005, and translations of her work in Dutch, Spanish, French, Italian, Ukrainian, and now English are in circulation. And men and women who've been devoted to her have turned her lyrics into poems, turned her poems into lyrics in pop, cabaret, and avant-garde music, and they've turned her life into plays. And today, Chernivtsi is Chernivtsi, Ukraine, and Chernivtsi residents are learning about Selma too. In September 2004, a plaque was placed on the tenement apartment where Selma lived, and our mother was invited to go to Chernivtsi to be part of this ceremony. Our mother began her short speech with the question, "How can I tell you about someone I never met?" Mother knew about Selma, who was her first cousin, but she actually knew very little about her life or about the lives of other relatives who perished in the camps, which was a common pattern among the children of Jewish immigrants, still overcome by the dense silence rooted in the fears of asking and having to remember. Our mother deeply regretted that silence and was grateful to German professors, Austrian literati, and the Green Party in Vienna, other NGO officials and others who joined in and made Chernivtsi and Chernivtsi welcome Selma. And these were all people who had given Selma back to us.
Should we do the-
Okay.
okay.
Since independence, cultural and political institutions from Austria and Germany have played a crucial role in increasing Czerniewski's awareness of Czernowic's German language and Jewish presence. But in order for this to happen, this work had to be translated into Ukrainian. And for that task, we have to thank Peter Ricklow, the university's principal professor of German, who has devoted his intellectual career to the Bukowina's contribution to German literature. So now Selma's writings and her history, the history of Czerniewski under fascism, can be taught in local high school classes and are made part of the public fabric.
Selma and her poetry have reappeared again in Europe just a few years ago. Uda Lemper, who's a well-known cabaret-style singer who lives part-time in the United States and who's devoted her life to singing again the songs from the Weimar Republic and recognizing the Jewish contribution to German life, was asked to sing one of Selma's songs at a commemoration of the Holocaust that was held in Rome. Yeah, that's the... And also in the United States, a group called Music of Remembrance commissioned Lori Laitman, who has written opera and art songs, to compose a song cycle based on Selma's poetry. She called that cycle, "In Sleep, the World is Yours." Sleep, my child. Just fall asleep. Please sleep, and don't cry anymore. Just look. In sleep, the world is yours. Please sleep, and don't cry so loud. Close your eyes and fall asleep. Listen, the forest is rustling. In sleep, there is no hate and no scorn, and in sleep, you are not cold. Sleep, my darling, and smile, my child. Listen, the river is singing. Sleep, then the wind will sing of joy and sing of the blossoming spring. Sleep, my child, and forget your ails. For you, the day is dark. Bright is the night when a dream cuddles you. So sleep, my child, so sleep. In the last poem in Blütenlese, Harvest of Blossom, Selma describes tragedy. This is the hardest, to give yourself away and then to see that no one needs you, to give all of yourself and realize you'll fade like smoke and leave no trace. Paul Celan said that a poem is essentially dialogue. It can be a message sent out in a bottle, not always with great hope that somewhere and somehow it could land on heartfelt shore. Writing poetry was the most human act for Selma, an act of connection, and connection was the trace, the history, that a tragic, inhuman world would erase. Sharing Paul Celan's hope, we would like to think that the very act of writing tragedy, Selma tricked tragedy, renounced it, even if not always greatly hopeful that she had succeeded. Miracle or no, her poetry has come on shore here in Czernowitz and also here in Berkeley, and it is still talking, still part of the world, still making those connections, still connecting human beings across decades and continents, still grabbing life. Thank you.
We have some time for some questions for our speakers.
I'm just going to jump to something about the two of you and wanted to know how it was for the two of you to collaborate as sisters and as academicians and as relatives of Selma on this effort.
Why don't you? It wasn't easy. Maybe some things are better left to further contemplate.
Yeah. But it gave us an opportunity to work together in
Yeah.
a way that we never had.
Yeah.
And even though theoretically we talk about, as you had mentioned, sort of similar interests, sort of psychiatry being to the individual, maybe what anthropology is to culture, but we never really had a chance to put it together in the same way that we did with this work.
And it was a pleasure to go together to find that poem that was left on a heartfelt shore. We'd never been to Chernovitz before.
It was this
And
mythical town.
mythical town, but frankly, neither Helene or I were kind of roots people. And we really didn't, I mean, I did research and worked in Peru, and she'd worked in New Mexico, and it just didn't enter our minds to go there until Selma led the way.
So I have, what else? The Jewish question. Do you know anything about her family and her extended family and their Jewish life? Was it assimilated? Was it towards the left, labor, Buddhist, or was it religious? And did you find any evidence of any of her poems, any Jewish content, any Jewish references or history or perhaps Hebrew words?
Gee,
Oh, yes.
So Selma was our mother's first cousin, and our family in the United States was also sort of labor Zionistic in its socialist in its ways, socialist.
Pink, when we asked Mother what color were our diapers, she said, well, somewhere between pink and red.
So, and Selma was very connected with the labor Zionist movement. But I think in terms of religious practice, there was a lot of variation. But in general, they were not orthodox in practice. They were less traditional in practice.
They were secular.
They were secular. But interestingly, so being part of that family, my children were all bar mitzvah. And our daughter, Sarah, who's named for Selma, read poem at her bas mitzvah. Selma wrote one poem that's very specifically connected to Jewish joy, and that is Jilu, which was really written like a hora in response to the joy of Hasidic dance.
So I have two questions. One amplifies on that one. There are many labor Zionist groups, so I'm wondering if you know which ones specifically. But completely separate from that, I'm wondering, it's not clear to me at all the timeline, like when did you two learn about this poetry collection and how it entered your life, getting it to the point where here we are?
Here we go.
Well,
I mean, did you always know about her, or?
No.
No, but my mother was her closest living relative. Or let's put it this way, Selma had several first cousins. And there was a first cousin who grew up with her in Chernovitz and who was successfully able to move to Palestine, who really became the central point for the collection and eventual publication of family publication of her poetry in Israel. But after she passed away, and the poetry was then also published by a commercial press in Germany, my mother became the literary editor, I guess you'd say. Although my mother never met Selma.
Where was your mother?
Well, she was born in Cambridge, but she grew up in Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, if that means anything. And her father left Chernovitz before World War I, but some of the other family that she was very close to left Chernovitz after World War I, and they remained close to their sisters, my grandfather and my Uncle Seymour's sister, who was Selma's mother. But my mother never met Selma, never met her aunt, Selma's mother. And I think that tore at her towards the end of her life. And that's why when she, out of the blue, was invited to be part of the ceremony where the plaque was instated on the walls of her tenement apartment, said, "What can I say to you? I don't know Selma. I never knew Selma." And I would say, but it's these people who made Selma an important part of their lives, who were really Selma's kin, and they made Selma our kin too.
We did not know who Selma was. I mean, going back to your earlier question, I honestly didn't think anyone in our family died in the Holocaust.
Really?
For a long time, until I was older. I mean, it was part of what wasn't talked about. And even though we had family in Israel who came to the United States and who did not speak about what had happened to them, I myself, between say 10 and 15 or 16, didn't realize that all these other people had died, right? Including Selma. I mean, I knew we had
Family. Huh? You knew we had family.
We knew we had family in Chernovitz, but not that they had died. We knew we had Uncle Lanyu, our uncle bribed to get him out of Romania into Israel, and that there were the stories of the one cousin who survived. But there were two other cousins who didn't. And we didn't really talk about that. But it was with the publication of the book that in 1980, and my mother's opportunity to become the manager of that literary estate, that led to our understanding, really understanding that we had family there. And then we started learning about that family and learning about that history. And then
and also, I actually had been working on the Spanish Inquisition.
But no one.
But no one.
Kind of surprised. The Spanish Inquisition.
And in Peru. And when I started researching that book, I read Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism. And she talked about trying to search for what might have been the precedent for the Holocaust in Europe. And she turned to 19th century German colonialism, a time when people were redefined in terms of master races and inferior races, and a time when you could establish bureaucratic institutions to carry forth their plan. And I think reading that and seeing that as what her suggestion was to me was to re-examine colonialism in light of the Inquisition in Peru and how it functioned to also demarcate certain kinds of citizens, and especially those, they published a range of heretical practices, but at certain times they were very interested in pursuing people who they considered to be hidden Jews who were secretly practicing Judaism, but not just practicing Judaism, but they were involved in conspiracies, uniting with the Dutch or with the slaves, with Negros, and with Indian populations to overturn the Spanish. Theories go back hundreds of years. And thinking about that, and then I finished it, and Selma, we were invited to Selma's, and I thought, I really want to think about what those connections might be, too.
The group that Selma was part of was called
Hashomer
Hatzair.
Yeah.
And that is sort of the uniform that she's wearing, the white blouse
with the ribbon.
Oh, is that?
That is very similar, these kind of uniforms. They were in Poland, they were It's very similar. Might be a little different, but that's the idea. a certain type of.
Oh, isn't
That's
that
something, yeah,
interesting?
that is, yes, we never knew that. Thank you very much.
This may be a little copy of it or something, but that's.
Yeah.
This is a.
Oh, great. Oh.
Please join me again in thanking our speakers.